The teachings of Ramana Maharishi, in his own words, suffering. One of the problems about which Bhagwan was often asked was suffering. The questions were usually personal rather than academic, since it was often the experience of grief which drove people to seek solace from him. The real solace came as a silent influence, but he did also answer theoretical questions. The usual answer was to bid the questioner find out who is it that suffers, just as he would bid the doubter find who it is that doubts. For the self is beyond suffering as it is beyond doubt. Sometimes, however, on a more contingent level, he would point out that whatever makes a person dissatisfied with his state of ignorance and turns him to the quest of the self is beneficial, and that is often suffering, which is the means of doing this. Bhagwan said, the bliss of self is always yours, and you will find it if you seek it earnestly. The cause of your misery is not in your outer life, it is in you. As your ego, you impose limitations on yourself and then make a vain struggle to transcend them. All unhappiness is due to the ego. With it comes all your trouble. What does it avail you to attribute the cause of misery to the happenings of life when that cause is really within you? What happiness can you get from things extraneous to yourself? When you get it, how long will it last? If you would deny the ego and squash it by ignoring it, you would be free. If you accept it, it will impose limitations on you and throw you into a vain struggle to transcend them. That was how the thief sought to ruin King Janaka. To be the self that you really are is the only means to realize the bliss that is ever yours. A very devoted and simple devotee had lost his only son, a child of 3. The next day he arrived at the asarman with his family. Referring to them, Bhagwan said, training of mind helps one to bear sorrows and bereavements with courage, but the loss of one's children is said to be the worst of all griefs. Grief only exists as long as one considers oneself to have a definite form. If the form is transcendent, one knows thus oneself to be eternal. There is neither death nor birth. What is born is only the body, and this is the creation of the ego. But the ego is not ordinarily perceived without the body, and so is identified with it. It is thought that matters. Let the sensible man consider whether he knew his body while in deep sleep. Why then does he feel it in the waking state? Although the body was not felt in sleep, did not the self exist? What was his state when in deep sleep, and what is it now when awake? What is the difference? The ego rises up, and that is waking. Simultaneously, thoughts arise. Find out who has the thoughts. Where do they come from? They must arise from the conscious self. Apprehending this even vaguely helps towards the extinction of the ego. The realization of the one infinite existence becomes possible. In that state, there are no individuals but only eternal being. Hence, there is no thought of death or grieving. If a man thinks that he is born, he cannot escape the fear of death. Let him find out whether he was ever born or whether the self takes birth. He will discover that the self always exists, and that the body which is born resolves itself into thought, and that the emergence of thought is the root of all mischief. Find where thought comes from, and then you will abide in the ever present inmost self and be free from the idea of birth and fear of death. Devotee asked, if someone we love dies, it causes grief. Should we avoid such grief by either loving all alike or not loving at all? Bhagwan said, if someone we love dies, it causes grief to the one who continues living. The way to get rid of grief is not to continue living. Kill the griever, and who will then remain to grieve? The ego must die. That is the only way. The two alternatives you suggest amount to the same. When all are realized to be the one self, who is there to love or hate? Sometimes, however, the questions were impersonal, referring not to some private tragedy but to the evil and suffering in the world. In such cases, they were usually by visitors who did not understand the doctrine of non duality or follow the path of self inquiry. Visitors said, widespread distress such as famine and pestilence spreads havoc through the world. What is the cause of this state of affairs? Bhagwan asked, to whom does all this appear? Visitor said, that won't do. I see misery all around. Bhagwan said, you were not conscious of the world and its suffering while asleep, but you are now that you are awake. Continue in the state in which you are not affected by such things. When you are not aware of the world, that is to say, when you remain as the self in the state of sleep, its suffering do not affect you. Therefore, turn inward and seek the self, and there will be an end both of the world and its miseries. Visitors said, but this is selfishness. Bhagwan said, the world is not external to you because you wrongly identify yourself with the body. You see the world outside you and its suffering becomes apparent to you. But the world and its suffering are not real. Seek the reality and get rid of this unreal feeling. This the visitor was unwilling to do, but instead referred again to suffering and to those who strive vainly to remove it. Visitor said, there are great men and public workers who cannot solve the problem of suffering in the world. Bhagwan said, this is because they are based on the ego. If they remained in the self, it would be different. Still presuming the absolute reality of the objective world, the visitor now asked in an indirect way how it would be different, demanding that those who abide in the self should accept the unreal as real. Visitor asked, why don't Mahatmas help? For the moment, Bhagwan answers on the visitor's own level. Bhagwan said, how do you know that they don't? Public speeches, outer activity and material help are all outweighed by the silence of the Mahatmas. They accomplish more than others. Now the visitor comes to the practical point, outer activity instead of inner quest, and Bhagwan rejects that viewpoint no less categorically. Visitor asked, what can we do to ameliorate the condition of the world? Bhagwan said, if you remain free from pain, there will be no pain anywhere. The trouble now is due to your seeing the world outside yourself and thinking there is pain in it. But both the world and the pain are within you. If you turn inward, there will be no pain. Visitor said, God is perfect. Why did he create the world imperfect? A work partakes of the nature of its author. but in this case it is not so. Bhagwan said, "Are you something separate from God that you ask this question? So long as you consider yourself the body, you see the world as external to you. It is to you that the imperfection appears. God is perfection and His work is also perfection. But you see it as imperfect because of your wrong identification with the body or the ego." Visitor asked, "Why did the self manifest as this miserable world?" Bhagwan said, "In order that you might seek it, your eyes cannot see themselves, but if you hold a mirror in front of them, they see themselves. Creation is the mirror. See yourself first and then see the world as the self." Visitor asked, "Then what it amounts to is that I should always turn inwards?" Bhagwan said, "Yes." Visitor asked, "Should not I see the world at all?" Bhagwan said, "But you are not told to shut your eyes to the world, only to see yourself first and then see the whole world as the self. If you consider yourself as the body, the world appears to be external. If you are the self, the world appears as Brahm manifested. The trouble is that it is extremely difficult to regard the body or the objective world as unreal." Bhagwan admitted that in the following dialogue. Devotee asked, "I have a toothache. Is that only a thought?" Bhagwan said, "Yes." Devotee asked, "Then why can't I think that there is no toothache and so cure myself?" Bhagwan said, "One doesn't feel the toothache when one is absorbed in other thoughts or when asleep." Devotee said, "But still it remains." Bhagwan said, "So strong is man's conviction of the reality of the world that it is not easily shaken off. But the world is no more real than the individual who sees it." Then a humorous exchange will illustrates the difficulty of the concept. Devotee asked, "At present there is a Sino-Japanese war going on. If it is only in the imagination, can or will Sri Bhagwan imagine it not to be going on and so put an end to it?" Bhagwan laughing. The Bhagwan of the questioner, whom the questioner sees as an external being, is as much a thought of his as the Sino-Japanese war. Finally, a quotation which shows how Bhagwan sometimes answered on a more contingent plane, pointing out that it is suffering that makes a man discontented with the life of the ego and spurs him on to seek self-realization. Devotee asked, "But why should there be suffering now?" Bhagwan said, "If there were no suffering, how could the desire to be happy arise? If that desire did not arise, how could the quest of the self arise?" Devotee asked, "Then it is all suffering good?" Bhagwan said, "Yes." "What is happiness? Is it a healthy and handsome body, regular meals, and so on? Even an emperor has endless troubles, although he may be in good health. So all suffering is due to the false notion, I am the body. Getting rid of this is knowledge." Hari Om Tat Sat.